Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Potter Revisited, a Harry Potter podcast where I, Laura Bradburn, take you on my journey as I reread the Harry Potter books for the first time since childhood. Today it's Philosopher's Stone, Chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. Let's go! Hi everybody and welcome to the latest episode of Potter Revisited. As I said, my name's Laura and thanks very much for joining me. This is the third episode of the podcast. Quite proud of myself for getting this far actually, because what is it they say? It takes 3 times to create a habit, and we're at the third time, so hopefully this isn't the last time you'll hear me. It's just been a really enjoyable process, going through all the setup and getting to know how to do things and using the editing software, using all the technology to record the podcast. It's just been really something new to learn, something really fun, so I've really enjoyed it. I had lots more great feedback from the listeners. There have been plural. I think we're just approaching 50 downloads for the first 2 episodes actually as I'm talking to you, so there are actually people out there listening to this. Who'd have thought it? But anyway, we are here today to discuss Chapter 2, as I said, of The Philosopher's Stone, The Vanishing Glass. So this is the first chapter in which things sort of start to progress a little bit. Obviously last week we covered Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived, and that kind of covered the whole episode of Harry's parents being killed by Voldemort and him being dropped off at the Dursleys to be raised outside of the wizarding world. Before we get into my thoughts on the chapter and everything like that, some of the feedback and some of the reflection that I had myself on the podcast last week was basically that I was very good at, well, not very good at, that's a bit of a jump, but I was very keen to give my thoughts on various parts of how the chapter worked, how it was written, and what my thoughts were based on, my experience of reading it. But having listened back to it myself and knowing that some of the people listening have said to me that they are listening to it not even as first time readers, but as having never read the books before, I don't think I made it very clear what actually happened in the chapter. So what I'm planning to do going forward is to start each podcast with, a summary of what happened, the main events, before sort of breaking down exactly what my thoughts were on the chapter. So with that in mind, we're going to start with a kind of brief summary of Chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass of the Philosopher's Stone. Straight off the mark, we are set 10 years into the future so there's been a 10-year time jump from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2. Harry's now 11 years old, still living with the Dursleys at 4 Privet Drive. The particular day that you pick up events is on his cousin Dudley's birthday. And throughout the course of the chapter, various things happen which leave you in no doubt as to the Dursley's opinion of Harry. The way that he's treated is nothing short of, well, the only word for it is abusive, but anyway, we'll get into that a bit later. The chapter takes place on Dudley's birthday, and through certain circumstances Harry is taken along to the zoo with Dudley and a friend of Dudley's to celebrate his birthday. During the course of that visit to the zoo, Harry inadvertently performs magic which allows the release of a snake from the zoo. That's when we start to understand that Harry's not like everybody else in the world around him, that there's something particularly special about him, and that's basically what happens. That this initial event suggests, that Harry's got powers somewhat beyond his own control, beyond the control of anybody around him, and that's sort of where we're left before Chapter 3. So now that that's done, and you've got a brief idea of exactly what happened in the chapter, we're going to go into a little bit of the thoughts of what I felt when I was reading the chapter. I have to say, when I first opened up the book and saw the heading for the chapter, I did have a little smile come across my face, because as many of you who are listening will know, having seen the films and things like that, this particular chapter of the book is basically lifted almost word for word out of the book and placed onto film in the first film. The visit to the zoo is part of it. And the vanishing glass actually refers to the glass in the snake enclosure, which Harry inadvertently makes disappear with his magical powers. Disappointingly for me, you may recall that in the film Dudley ends up falling into the snake enclosure, at which point when the glass disappears, and then once he falls in, the snake escapes and Dudley goes to get back out and the glass has replaced itself, or Harry's done the inadvertent magic to replace itself and gets trapped in. Unfortunately, in the book, as I had forgotten, Dudley doesn't fall into the snake enclosure. That was deemed a little bit too graphic, perhaps, for a children's novel. He steps back in shock, is the wording that's used. So I was a bit disappointed to read that, but hey, what can you do? It's not all going to be the same. I've said a couple of times during the recording already that Harry's unaware of his magical powers, and what's very clear throughout the course of the chapter is the reason for that is the Dursleys have done everything in their power to make sure that he isn't aware of the magical powers that he has. It was touched on in chapter 1 that they were aware that Lily Potter, Harry's mum, had magical powers and that they didn't approve of it. They thought she was weird. They thought her husband James was weird. They were suspicious that Harry had similar powers and was why they were wary of them, and indeed that's why they treat him as badly as they do. With that in mind, they have told him, for example, that his mum and dad died in a car crash. We know that not to be true, but they told him that they died in a car crash, that they weren't, not that they were killed by the most powerful wizard ever to have lived. And there's various, suggestions that they continue to disapprove of anything magic. There's suggestions that anything out of the ordinary that happens, they're suspicious of Harry for having caused it, even though he himself isn't aware how he might have caused some of these things to happen, or what role he might have played in it. They've played down his magical powers, and as a result, he's unaware of his ability to do it, even if he is inadvertently doing it. It's not just the magic though that's hidden or that's treated with disdain. Harry himself's treated with disdain. There's descriptions throughout the book. Obviously, we become aware very early on in the chapter that he's sleeping under the stairs, which, given the size of the house, you might find that might happen occasionally, but really it's probably never acceptable, who knows. Kept under the stairs, he's made to cook the breakfast for everybody on Dudley's birthday. A suggestion in the book that you wouldn't know Harry lived there if you didn't see him sitting in the living room. There's no photos of him, there's plenty of photos of Dudley. Throughout his phases of growing up, there's nothing of Harry there. And in fact, Harry being on the visit to the zoo for Dudley's birthday is nothing more than an inconvenience for the Dursleys, because usually he gets sent to stay with, I think her name's Mrs. Figgs, gets sent to stay with her every other year of Dudley's birthday. But on this occasion she's broken her leg and therefore can't take him, so that's why Harry ends up going to the zoo. He gets thoroughly warned beforehand about no funny business from Uncle Vernon, and that turns out not to be the case with what happens. We see why it's called funny business, because Uncle Vernon's suspicious that something is going to happen and it's going to be Harry's fault, and that's what happens. I think what this chapter really achieves is putting across to the reader exactly the kind of upbringing that Harry must have had over the last decade. He's been treated absolutely appallingly, and he knows he's different, but he really doesn't know why. And it's really well done, actually, because it's not just the snake enclosure incident that he's involved in that causes people to react badly to him, but there's a small section in the chapter as well which discusses how he's always felt out of place and things have always happened that he's been unable to explain. So I think a couple of the examples are that he was running away from Dudley and his friends at school, went to jump and hide behind some dustbins and ended up on the roof of the school. He doesn't know how he got there. Obviously we know that it's probably magic that's caused it, but But to him and to the Dursleys, there's no real explanation for it. Another thing is when he's forced to try on some hand-me-down clothes of Dudley's, as his Aunt Petunia goes to pull it over his head, the more force she pulls it with, the smaller the item gets. And again, that's done through magic, but they explain it away as, something shrunk in the wash. So it's clear that throughout his childhood, there's been powers that he's had that he's been unable to control or explain, but they are there. It's kind of in the genes or whatever. And he's really, he knows he's different, and he's having to deal with that on top of the fact that he's being treated appallingly by the Dursleys. I found this chapter really, I don't want to say I didn't enjoy it, because I did. It brings a smile to your face because you remember the film. It's quite a funny incident to happen to quite a horrendous family. And you know that it's Harry that's caused the incident to happen. I have to say though, without the presence of Dumbledore, Hagrid, McGonagall, all those that were in the first chapter, you kind of, maybe it's just me personally, but I found myself reading this chapter kind of going, itching to get back to those characters and to that world. Whether I felt differently than that when I was a child reading it, can't really remember. And also, I didn't have the benefit of knowing what was to come and knowing that these characters that were so heavily featured in chapter 1 were going to be so heavily featured later on. So whether that's something that's just a side effect of having already read the books once through and seen the films or not, I don't know. But it's something I mentioned in the last podcast, and something that I'm sure is going to come up multiple times as I'm going through the books, it's a reason why I don't tend to reread books, because I do find it slightly distracting to read them having read them before, because I find myself, especially in situations like this where the chapter that we're reading is particularly, well, it wasn't uneventful, there was quite a major event in it actually, but when you view a chapter through the lens of this is to get us from point A to point B, namely in the case of Harry to get us to put across the message that the Dursleys are abusive and they don't treat him well, and to also imply that he has magical powers. But once you've got that message, you kind of just want the chapter to be over and to move on to the next part. I have vague recollections of reading further on in the series and just enjoying reading the parts of the book where they're at Hogwarts and just soaking all that in, because it's so vividly described and it's a happy place for Harry to be, and it's therefore a happy place for the reader to be, and it seemed like such a magical place that even if something pretty non-eventful was happening in a chapter at Hogwarts, just the fact that it was set in Hogwarts was enough for you to read it. This one was a little bit more, it wasn't even a slog, because the writing is so good, but I did find myself reading through it going, right, let's get to the next chapter, let's crack on with this, let's get the story going. And I think probably what might happen in the future, especially with this podcast, is the next time I come across a chapter like this, it might be a case of having to, chunk it together with another chapter, because you find yourself in a situation where you're sort of thinking, is this worth dedicating a whole episode to? Probably not, but that is the structure of how we're doing things, so we'll crack on for the moment. One thing I did want to talk about was, and I perhaps didn't explain quite as fully as I should have when we were talking about the way in which the snake escapes from the enclosure at the zoo, is Mr. Dursley and Dudley are trying to get the snake to move because Dudley gets whatever he wants and he wants the snake to be less boring, in quotation marks. They fail to get it to move, so they move on to something else, and Harry as we've all done from one time or another, starts talking to the animal in a kind of sympathetic way. You know, this must be really terrible for you, all these idiots coming up to the glass and annoying you all day. And he starts to get the impression that the snake is responding to him, answering his questions with nods of the head, shakes of the head, things like that. And even then, when the glass disappears and the snake escapes from the enclosure, Harry's convinced that the snake says thanks, which of course we know it does. What I found really clever about this, and what was an advantage of having read the books before, is we all know the importance of Harry being able to speak to the snake. Now, I same as in previous discussions we've had about the chapters and things like that, I went back to it and I thought, is there any clue whatsoever that him speaking to the snake is in any way significant? And I have to say there wasn't. I mean, obviously the snake's responding to him and shaking and nodding its head and all that kind of stuff. But it's so well written that you still believe that it could be all Harry's imagination, and there's no suggestion that he's using anything other than English to talk to this snake. So I thought it was really well written, bearing in mind the significance of his ability to talk to snakes in later chapters, and I thought that was like a point really worth highlighting, that there is nothing given away there in terms of spoilers by the writer, and I thought it was really cleverly done. Obviously it's going to be called back to multiple times in the books going forward, but it was just really well done. Another thing that I thought was really cleverly done was the way in which they kind of mixed Harry's, well, he assumes that they are dreams, but we know that they are memories. So he talks about dreaming about a flying motorbike and a flash of green and a burning searing pain in his head. And we know that those dreams, when he voices them and vocalises them to the Dursleys, are dismissed as silly dreams and nothing more. I just thought it was really interestingly done, that I thought it achieved the dual nature of making you aware that Harry knows to some extent, or has some memory of what's happened to him before. Obviously the dream about the flying motorbike is in reference to him being delivered as a baby by Hagrid to 4 Privet Drive, and then the flash of green light is in reference to the curse that was placed on him when Voldemort tried to kill him. And in combination with that, you've got him remembering that and dreaming about that, and in stark contrast you've got the Dursleys dismissing it. They know it to be true. They know that what he's saying is correct, but by dismissing what he's saying, they are making clear their views on magic, which they already have done. And I have to say, we're only on page 34 of the book, I think, by the end of chapter 2, and you are left in absolutely no doubt about the nature of the Dursleys and their attitude to magic. I just think it's really, really well done in relatively few words, and I think, again, just displays the, like, really, what's the word? The really masterful way that it's written by J.K. Rowling. There's no other word for it, really. That's basically all I've got to say on this particular chapter. Again, it's a really, really short podcast just because of the nature of the chapter. It was really short, pretty uneventful. I have to say, if I find like I said before, if I find a chapter that's similar in nature to this, what I might end up doing is chucking a few chapters together just to give us a little bit more to discuss in each podcast. But you can let me know what you think of that idea going forward. If you want to be involved in the podcast at all, if you want to appear on the podcast either to discuss a particular chapter with me as I'm reading it, or if you just want to come on and discuss your love of Harry Potter, then I'd be more than welcome to have guests on the podcast. Just get in touch with me via @PotterRevisited, either on Twitter, or we're now on Instagram as well, and we can see what we can do. We marry up the diaries, obviously, and just make sure that we're together and able to do it at the same time. Thanks very much for joining me, everybody. Next week will be chapter 3, where I think things are about to get kicking off. Something suggests to me that Harry might be getting a wee letter in the post. So thanks for joining me, and I'll catch up with you next week. This was an episode of Harry Potter Revisited with Laura Bradburn, and the music that you can hear in the background was provided by Purple Planet. That's purple-planet.com, a platform online where you can get free samples of music for all your digital output. Thank you very much.